I call this design the Abigail, but you can call it whatever you want, like Francois or Elizabeth, but I think I'm going to stick with Abigail. And today I'm going to show you how to build it. I've always had this never-ending urge to design and build stuff. And when I found these two forgotten oak boards in the back of my shop, I just couldn't help myself. I just needed to build something with it. And what better than a dresser for our baby that's on her way into our lives. So like you might have guessed, I didn't have a lot of time or material to work with. I only had these two boards, one oak plank that I had left from a different project, and other scrap boards that were lying around in my shop. Now these two boards were lying in my shop for the past 2 years, and as you can see, they were warped. Badly. I needed to rework one of the boards to actually be able to use it. Not only did it have a bow, but also a cup right in the middle. I tried removing most of the board's bow by cutting off a piece on the top and bottom. I took what was left of the board to the table saw and ripped it right through the middle. I then glued the two boards together. Added some dominos just to be safe, and that gave me a semi-decent board to work with. Now while we wait for the glue to dry, let's jump into CAD and talk about the design for a minute. Our dresser is going to consist out of 8 main pieces. 2 side panels cut out of the thicker 30mm oak board. A top panel cut out of the thinner 20mm oak board. To give the top panel the same appearance as the side panels, an oak strip will be edge banded to the front. To support the rest of the board, 10mm planks will be added at the joining surfaces at the middle, back and sides. The bottom panel will be made out of MDF, and an oak strip will also be edge banded to the front. These 4 panels will be joined together with 45-degree miters, and to support the joints, dominos will be added. A rabbet will also be cut into the back of these 4 panels that will house a 15mm plywood board. The same plywood will be used for the vertical partition, and it will be covered up with an oak strip in the front. The base will be cut out of an extra oak plank. It will consist out of 4 legs and 4 stretchers that will be joined together with some dominos. And finally, the drawer boxes. The drawer sides will be made out of 16mm melamine board. And for the drawer bottoms, 3mm masonite will be used. The drawer fronts will be made out of 16mm MDF that will be painted white. And to give the dresser a more modern look, a 45-degree chamfer will be added to the inner edges of the dresser box and base. Now back to the shop. I started by cutting the 2 side panels and 2 oak strips out of the 30mm board. The only thing to note here is that I'm not finalizing the dimensions yet. All of the following cuts are just rough cuts. For the bottom panel, I didn't have a big enough 30mm board left, so I decided to glue 2 15mm sheets together. While I waited for the bottom panel's glue to dry, I started to cut the 2 50mm oak strips that will be used on the top and bottom panels to their rough length. After the panel had dried, I scraped off some of the excess glue and used my track saw to cut a new clean edge that will be used to glue the oak strip to. The oak strips were bent quite badly, so I decided to use dominos to straighten them up. I then repeated the entire process for the top panel as well. I know it might seem as overkill to use dominos for this oak strips, but I can assure you that it was definitely necessary. These strips weren't a solid piece of oak. It consisted out of several short pieces and it was definitely not stable. I then used my track saw to cut the bottom panel to its final length. Instead of measuring, I used my bottom panel as reference and cut the top panel to the exact same length. I then used my table saw to cut all of the 4 panels to the same depth. I checked if all the panels aligned correctly, and I also marked where all the dominoes should be. The last step to finish the top panel was to reinforce the joining surfaces. I added a 10mm plank to the middle, back and sides of the board. Now it was almost time to cut the miter joints. Due to the size and thickness of the panels, I needed a guarantee to ensure that the visible outer edge will look perfect. To achieve this, I set my blade to slightly past 45 degrees, like barely past, at 44.9 degrees. This will ensure that the miters will rather be closed on the outside instead of the inside of the joint. It is quite difficult to cut miters on such a large panel, especially if you want to do it safely and accurately. So for this project I made this miter sled for my table saw. If anyone wants to see how I built this sled, please leave a comment below and I'll make a video about it. After checking that the 4 panels aligned correctly, I then moved on to cut the front bevel and back rabbet on each of the 4 panels. Just to make the alignment of the miter joints easier, I added 3 dominoes on each corner. To be on the safe side, I dry fitted the box to make sure that all of the panels aligned correctly. While still assembled, I measured and cut a back panel out of a piece of 15mm plywood. Now that I know that everything fits correctly, I took the entire assembly apart and started with the glue up. And if I can give one piece of advice, don't use fast drying glue for this type of assemblies, especially while doing it alone. While I waited for the glue to dry, I cut another piece of plywood that will be used for the vertical partition. I then edge banded oak strips to the front of the partition in order to match the rest of the dresser. After giving it some time to dry, I then sanded the partition smooth and ripped it to its final dimension on the table saw. I then used my Craig pocket hole jig to drill some pocket holes into the partition. By using screws, glue and some spacers for alignment, I fixed the partition to the dresser. Now that the cabinet is mostly finished, I could move my attention to the base. I know I said in the beginning of this video that I only had one plank available for this project, and you could clearly see a lot more on my lumber rack. Rest assured, I didn't lie. I am going to use the rest of those planks on a baby crib that will accompany this dresser. If you want to see that build, please subscribe to my channel so you won't miss it. To make it easier to mold the plank, I measured out what I need and cut the plank to rough length. Now that the plank is cut to rough length, I started my milling process. My process usually begins by jointing one face and one edge on the jointer. After that, I'll plane the opposite face on the planer. And then I'll rip the opposite edge on the table saw. But before I do that, I'm going to split the plank in 2 pieces. One for the stretchers and one for the legs. Now that the plank is molded and ripped into its different pieces, I could start by cutting the legs to their final length. I then used my dresser as reference and cut the stretches also to their final length. Now that all the pieces of the base were cut, I could move on to the next step, and that was to cut the tapers on the legs. Each leg had 2 tapers, and they were not symmetrical. So, I made a small table saw sled to cut them. The sled not only gave me the ability to do repeated cuts accurately, but also safely. The next step was to cut a little reveal in the top outside edge of the base. I did this to give more of a visual separation between the cabinet and the base. The final step before gluing the base together was to cut dominos into each leg and structure. I quickly checked if everything aligned and started the gluing process. While I waited for the glue to dry, I started doing some touch-up work on the cabinet. There were a few knots on the boards that were already filled, and I really didn't like the way they looked. So I decided to remove the filler and replace it with a black filler. For the larger knots, I used black knot filler. This was the first time I used this glue stick type of wood filler, and I must say, it was surprisingly easy and fast to work with. One thing to note is that it only worked on larger holes. For the smaller voids and holes, I used black super glue. Now back to the base. There was only one last step that had to be done before the base was finished, and that was to cut the bevel on the bottom outer edge of the base frame. Before I could cut the bevel, I had to fill all of the gaps and voids with oak wood filler. After all of the touch-ups were done, I started to sand the frame down with 80 grit sanding paper. To cut the bevel, I used a 45-degree chamfer bit on my palm router. I repeated the cut several times, increasing the depth with every pass. I did this until I reached a bevel of about 10 mm. I didn't like the round corner that the router bit left, so I used my chisel and hacksaw to give it a nice sharp edge. And to finish it off, I sanded it down with a 120 grit sanding block. Now that the base and cabinet was finished, the next step was to sand. I marked out all of the surfaces with a pencil and then started to sand with 80 grit sanding paper. Once I was finished with the 80 grit, I marked all of the surfaces again and started to sand with 120 grit. After I finished sanding with 120 grit, I wetted the surface with water in order to raise the grain. I then waited for it to dry and repeated the sanding process again with 120 grit. Once all of the sanding were finally done, I cleaned the surfaces with an air gun and wiped it down with a rag and some mineral spirits. Finally, it was time to apply the finish, and the finish I'll be using is Rubio Monocoat Natural. This was the first time I used Rubio Monocoat, and I must say, I'm very happy with it. The color was perfect, it was easy to apply, and very durable. I know there are several different methods to apply Rubio Monocoat on the internet, but the method I used worked out perfect, not only for the small surfaces of the base, but also for the larger surfaces of the cabinet. So how I did it? Using the white applicator pad, I applied a decent amount of Rubio to the surface with a circular motion. I then let it penetrate for about 5 minutes, then started to buff the surface with a clean white applicator pad. Once I went over the entire surface, I then used a terry cloth and wiped off all of the excess finish. And that was basically it. I was finished. With that done, I started by cutting the drawer fronts out of a piece of 16mm MDF on the table saw. Once I had 6 fronts, I sanded them down by hand and gave them 2 coats of white cabinet paint. I could then move on to cutting the pieces for the drawer boxes. Like I said before, the drawer boxes are made out of 16mm melamine for the sides and 3mm masonite board for the bottoms. Before I started to assemble the boxes, I edge banded the top edge of every board with white iron-on edge banding. Once that was finished and trimmed, I could assemble the boxes with some wood screws. I then completed the drawer boxes by adding the drawer hardware. I repeated these steps until I had 6 identical drawer boxes. Once the paint was completely dry, I fixed the handles onto the drawer fronts. The final step before I could actually assemble the dresser was to fix the hardware to the cabinets. And finally, it was time to insert the drawer boxes. I used some painter's tape and super glue to temporarily fix the fronts to the boxes. They were fixed just enough to be able to pull them out and run some screws in from the back. And just like that, the dresser was done. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I really enjoyed this build. If you want to build something similar, I do have plans available. It's in this description below. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you want to see similar building projects in the future, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks.